Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Bêne Otto about supporting someone who is grieving from a counselling psychologist perspective. Bêne Otto, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you back on board. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
No, I mean, yeah, we actually love that, and I was just saying just before the show, what Shaz and I have been doing is actually asking, for almost like comment from guests that have been on the show, and the response has been amazing still. So almost like doing almost like the next episode to the story, which introduces us to this topic, which is. We mentioned it in the previous one that we did around bereavement. And it's interesting because one would think death has been, I think that's what we said as well, death has been with us for generations, for as long as mankind has been around. But yet there isn't almost a way that we speak about bereavement and how do we support people. So maybe just to kick it off, tell us, are there any thoughts around this that you would like to share?
I have a lot of thoughts actually. I think you're absolutely right. Given, like I think we said last time, death, bereavement being, I think, arguably one of the most universal human experiences. Given that, it's strange to me that it's something that we find so difficult to speak about, and so difficult to approach. It seems like a topic that's just incredibly uncomfortable and awkward, and people just generally, I think, don't know what to do. They don't know how to handle the grief of others, the loss of others. So I do have a couple of thoughts on how to approach someone who has lost a loved one. I think the very first thing that stands out for me is to acknowledge the loss, to show up and to acknowledge that this person, be it your family member, be it your friend, your colleague, whoever the person is, but just to show up and acknowledge, sure, you have had a massive loss, and I want to acknowledge that, just acknowledge it head on, because I think a lot of the time because we either feel uncomfortable and awkward, or we feel fearful, we feel fearful when we know that someone else has lost a person. It makes us quite fearful. So whatever the reason may be of why, we might want to avoid the topic. So be that the discomfort, the awkwardness, the fear, maybe even the helplessness, faced with someone else's pain. We feel really incredibly helpless, like we want other people to not be in pain, to not be suffering. And whatever comes up for us, I think a lot of the time, a common reaction or a common response can be to avoid the topic, to avoid the fact that this person has lost a loved one, to not really acknowledge it, to maybe dance around the topic, or just, pretend it's not there altogether. And sometimes I think that can be helpful for us because it helps us manage our own discomfort, our own anxiety, our own helplessness. But for the person on the other side, it can I think often feel incredibly minimizing, incredibly dismissive when people don't acknowledge that, something terrible has happened to you in your life. Your life has probably been thrown upside down on its head. And to have that not acknowledged can be incredibly difficult. So I would definitely start there, to acknowledge the loss. And you do that by, showing up and saying, I don't know, I heard or I've seen that you've lost this person, and it must be incredibly difficult what you're going through. And I just want to acknowledge that. I'm so sorry that you're experiencing this. I'm so sorry that your person died. That's, I think, the first place to start. Then I would say, it's really important to not give into that discomfort, to not want to try and fix or change the experience of the griever. To pardon me, I think that when we feel uncomfortable, when we feel awkward, when we feel helpless, when we see the other person's pain, we want to minimize our discomfort and minimize their pain. We want to make it manageable for everybody. And often that can mean saying things that, even though they could be very well intended, might not be very helpful. And oftentimes I think that we try to say things to fix. We try to change the experience. So we say things like, well, at least they're no longer suffering. There's a silver lining. There's a positive point. They're no longer suffering, and at least we have that. Or everything does happen for a reason, so you're going to be okay. Everything will be fine because there's a greater plan for us all, and this was part of the plan. And as you can hear, those things can be really well intended. They can come from a place of genuine care and wanting to support a person. But for the receiver, I think that oftentimes saying things like that can feel like there's a double message. And the other message is, you shouldn't be feeling the way that you feel right now. We need to try and alter it. We need to try and fix it. We need to change your experience in some way. So that can feel, over time, especially when you have a lot of people saying things like, oh, try and cheer up, try and look on the bright side, or, it's time for you to start doing things again, or whatever the case may be. Those things add up. And I think over time, from a griever's perspective, it can feel like your experience gets, like I said before, minimized, invalidated, and like there's something wrong with whatever the experience may be. If you're heartbroken and, I don't know, struggling to contain yourself emotionally, or if you're not expressing emotionally at all, if you're finding it difficult to connect with the emotional side. Either way, I think with that sort of narrative, grievers get sort of communicated to that you can grieve, but not too much and not too little. And you need to manage it, you need to find that sweet spot. And an experience like grief is very often not something that can be controlled, that can be managed, that can be, okay, I'm choosing to grieve in this particular way. It's very often out of our control. So I guess that leads me to my second point, where you don't want to try and fix and change their experience, but you want to come and show up and mirror their reality. So mirror whatever it is that they're experiencing in that moment, in the present moment. And, when we mirror that, when we say, sure, I can see that this is so painful for you, or I can see that it seems to me like right now you're struggling to connect to the emotional side, and that's okay. Just to acknowledge what's happening for them and to validate it. Like, whatever's happening for you right now is fine. It's okay. You don't need to try and fix it or change it. It's, your person, your loss, your grief, and whatever's coming up for you right now in this moment, that's fine. You don't need to change it. You don't need to fix it. It's totally okay. Yeah. I've got more, but I think I'll just stop there for a second.
Yeah, I love that. And I do want to say, I suppose what you just said as well makes a lot of sense. It resonates with me because it's the most uncomfortable thing, and I think that's the reason we're having this conversation again, is although I said it's been around, for such a long time, it's such an uncomfortable situation that you almost like don't know what to do, and then it's like that analysis, paralysis by analysis or something. And, you're not sure how to support, so you just don't do anything, or you maybe do too much. And I like what you said about problem solving, because I think, especially from a man's sense, like you're always like trying to like fix it, like, well, why can't you get over this? What I also loved about what you said was it's almost like contextual, like, and I can't help but put a religious, connotation to this or angle to it, because I can't remember what the book was, but it was, but I see now a lot of bumper stickers around it. But it was an entrepreneurship book, and it said something to the effect of, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like one would, intellectually, we think, okay, especially if you're in a Christian faith, the person is going to a better place, is they're going to heaven. But in that moment, I don't think that person wants to hear that, even if they're in a better space. I mean, you don't want to hear that, because there's that sense of loss. So
Yes.
what you're saying, makes a lot of sense. And I think it's almost like when people are looking at this, they almost like must put that context into mind. Would you agree with
Yes.
something like that?
I do. I think you said something really important there, in terms of the context, and that makes me think in terms of the individual. Each experience of grief will be unique. There's no way around that. There might be similarities, yes. We may experience certain things similarly, but at the end of the day, all of our experiences of grief will be unique because our relationships are unique. My relationship to my person will be different to your relationship with your person, and so just as we're different as individuals, my personality will be different from yours, and how I cope with things might be different to the way that you cope with things. So our experiences will always be unique, and because of that, the support that we provide or that we would like to receive will also be unique. So, pardon me, if you are a religious person, and maybe something like, if you believe that your person has gone to a heaven, or if, say, from the Christian's perspective, gone to a heaven, and you believe that and you find comfort in that as the griever, then that's brilliant. Then maybe that is a good way to support that particular person. But if you're not necessarily religious, or like you say, you are religious, but in that moment, that's not something that's really helpful for you to hear. Maybe not right in that moment. Maybe that's something that later could be comforting for you, but in the, I don't know, a few days or weeks after losing a person, it's not something that you want to hear. Then it can also be not helpful. And I think, I might be sounding quite confusing, but what I'm trying to say is that each individual will be different. And if you're the person supporting a griever, at the end of the day, the simplest thing to do is to follow their lead. When you're not sure, ask them. For example, with a phrase like that, everything happens for a reason. To say that, sometimes I find comfort in that. I find comfort in thinking that my person is in a better place. I wonder if that's something that you find comfort in right now. That gives the person the opportunity to say, you know what, yes, I find comfort in that. Or actually, no, not right now. That's not something I find comforting at all. And then as the supporter, you can go, okay, and you can follow that lead. We know now that in this moment, maybe that later, but in this moment, that's not something that's comforting for you. So, and if then I'm like, well, I don't know how to comfort you then, to ask, to say, okay, so then how could I best comfort you? What would you find supportive from me right now? I guess that leads me to my next sort of point in supporting someone who's grieving is, I think a common thing that we do is when somebody dies, another thing that we often offer people is, let me know if you need anything. I'm here if you need anything. You just let me know. And again, well intended, I think it comes from a place of care often. Often it's just something that we say, it's something that is socially scripted in these kind of scenarios. We say, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. My sincere condolences. Let me know if there's anything you need. I'm here. It's almost like a script that we all sort of follow. So sometimes it's genuine, I think. Other times it's just a socially accepted thing to say.
Mhm.
With something like that, it can also be very hard. So if you put yourself in a position where you think that you've just lost someone incredibly dear to you, whoever that may be, your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother, your partner, someone incredibly important to you has just died. And your world has been shaken to its core. You don't know which way is left or right. You're just sort of in this new world that you don't recognize. And oftentimes, grievers don't know what they need. They don't know, they can't say, okay, you know what? This something terrible's happened. What I need is for you to do this and this and this and this, and that's how you can support me. Oftentimes they don't know. So when someone says, let me know if you need anything, they go, okay, all right. And it sort of stays there. So a great way, I think, to support someone who's grieving is to say, I know you have kids. I'm driving past this school this afternoon. Can I pick them up for you? I'm going to do that. If that's helpful for you, I'm picking them up. Or I'm bringing over dinner tonight. I've made a lasagna and I'm bringing that over, and here's dinner for you tonight. So you don't have to think about cooking. It's taking more of a proactive approach rather than putting the ball in the griever's court to tell you what you need to do. And again, checking in with the person, like, have you cooked? You haven't? Okay, great. I've got a spare lasagna. Would you like it? Okay, great. I'm bringing it over. Sort of taking that initiative and also checking in with them. Do you need this? Would you like this? Okay, great, done. Rather than the let me know if you need anything, or I'm here if you need anything.
Yeah, and I think, as you said that, the term in my mind again comes out. It's like such a cop out. It's like a very easy, like almost like it's like it's an easy way to almost like deflect responsibility, in a way.
Absolutely.
It's almost like, yeah, cool. And, as you said now, it's almost like, yes, you've done your part. But, and I can't help but thinking, like, there's the word love, like there's multiple meanings to it, and one is the actual act of doing stuff, like actually, affection, doing stuff. And what you just gave now is very tangible, and I think it was collaborated in another episode with Sally Baker, I think it was, and she was talking about birth trauma, and if like someone lost, just especially at that time, and there was another type of loss, but she said, just take a meal. Exactly what you said, take the lasagna. And it's almost like you showing that love by doing something. You're showing that you care. And it's interesting for me in those moments how people remember that. They almost like remember who was at the funeral. It's like weird, eh? They always can remember sometimes, like that. They can remember the small acts. And those are the things, that they almost like think about later on.
Yes.
So I love what you
Yes.
said about that. The other theme I always find around loss, especially losing a loved one, is this idea of regret. Do you find that that comes up a lot? I mean, you're always like regretful that you didn't do something or they didn't do something. Does that tie into loss in any way? I mean, they always like talk, that person wanted to have this meal, but I couldn't make it. Or, we were supposed to go to the movies, but we didn't manage to do that because this happened. And there's something about that, that closure that wasn't there, that almost like creates more of that. We spoke about the context. Almost like seems more hurtful. Do you find
Yes.
anything around that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the the way that we need to live our lives in a way that makes us feel safe in the world, in a way that makes us feel like life and the world that we live in is predictable. We need to believe that we have time, that we are in some sense invincible, that we will live, that we will have another opportunity to cook that meal or to have that conversation or to do that activity together. There'll always be another time. we often, I think it would be incredibly difficult if we did live our lives thinking that ourselves and everyone that we love and know will die. And that's the reality. That is the reality. We are all going to die. But if we live our lives that way, pardon me, it can be very anxiety provoking. Thinking that, on the one hand, it can make us connect more deeply, more meaningfully, and make us more appreciative of life. But on the other hand, it can make us feel very fearful, that I could lose the person that I love, or that I could die. So I think that we often think that we have more time. And it's always a shock when we realize that we don't. It's a shock when the reality plays out, when the inevitable but thing that we've been denying or thinking won't happen to us happens, and somebody we love dies, and it's a massive shock. And we do then start to think about, well, I should have done this, or I could have done that, or I thought we had more time, and I regret not doing this, or I regret not having that conversation. I think it's an inevitable response to that shock, to how we try and process it, how we try and process the fact that just like that, the time that we thought we had gets cut and stops there. We always have a last time we hugged someone, or a last time we spoke to someone, or a last time we ate with them or did something together. There's always a last time when the time gets cut and stopped. I think, yes, it's an inevitable part of losing somebody that we love.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad we asked that, because that seems to be and again, maybe that's more personal experience, though. It always seems to be like that, how it plays out, with people. They always mention that, and I always think that's interesting, like how that seems to be a similarity. So we spoke about, in terms of, what can we do? Is there things that we should not say? I mean, like, is there, and again, that's the reason I want to do the episode, is because, like as you said, it's well-meaning, but is there certain things that we should not be saying?
I think there are, yes. So the first thing we don't want to do is we don't want to try and fix or change the experience. We also shouldn't or want to be trying to avoid minimizing or dismissing the experience. So when someone says, this is hard, I'm heartbroken, my world is falling apart, it's not for us to decide whether or not that's true, whether or not that's valid, or to say, oh, it can't be that bad. I'm sure it's not great. I'm sure it sucks, but it's not that bad, right? It's not for us to decide what someone else's experience is really like. If someone says that this is hard and I'm heartbroken and, I'm devastated, believe them, accept that as their reality, as their truth. Don't try to minimize or dismiss it, even when it feels uncomfortable. Because I think it's incredibly uncomfortable when someone says, I'm absolutely devastated. I don't know how I'm going to continue my life without this person. People go, whoa, this is really awkward. This is really uncomfortable. Oh, it's not that bad though, right? It's not that bad. And that can be incredibly, incredibly painful, incredibly damaging to someone who's grieving, to feel like people don't understand how bad this is for you, how hard this is for you, how devastating it is for you. So don't minimize, don't dismiss the experience, just accept it as it is, as someone tells you it is, and as someone displays that it is. It's not for us to decide what someone else's grief is like or should be like. It's not for us to say, well, you could tone it down a bit. Or you could tone it up a bit, it could be a little bit more emotional here. That's not for us to decide. So accept people's experiences as they are. try not to, excuse me, try not to make comparisons. And I think that's something that we often also do is, when someone says, I'm going through a really tough time, we go, oh, I also went through a really tough time, or, I also lost someone, so I know what it's like. We compare our losses, we compare our grief. And it's not to say that your loss isn't valid. Your grief isn't valid or important. It is. But maybe not in that context. When we've got someone in front of us who's just lost someone that they love and they're devastated by it, we need to let it be about them without making it about us. Maybe there'll come a time, where it's more appropriate to share, to say, this is what helped me when I lost my person, or this is how I felt. I don't know if you feel that way too, but this is how I felt. Maybe there is a time and a place for that, but it's definitely not when, someone has just lost a person to say, oh yeah, I know what that's like. When I lost my baby, then this is what happened for me, so I know what that's like. Because you might be able to relate. You might be able to, empathize, truly deeply empathize with someone because of your own experience. But our experiences are still unique at the end of the day. So what is true for you might not be true for another. So try to avoid, I would say, making comparisons unless, the person asks you, unless the person says, I never thought it would hurt like this. Did it hurt like this for you when you lost your person? Then okay. But not at the, get-go making the comparisons. Don't be afraid to mention their person. Don't be afraid to bring it up. I think that's so important. Don't be scared to say the person's name because they're dead. Don't be scared to say, oh, Mark, what a great guy. I love this about him. Or, I'm going to miss his infectious smile. To talk about the person, to mention the person to the griever. Don't be scared to talk about it, to ask them about the person. Don't be scared to mention their name. I think those things, they may seem small and insignificant, but to someone who's grieving, to someone who's lost a Mark, let's say, that Mark is incredibly important and special, even though that they're dead, and they're not going to forget about Mark. And it can be so healing when someone says, I was thinking about Mark and I was remembering X, Y, and Z about him. It can be incredibly powerful for the person who's grieving to know that their person is important for other people too. To know that, they do live on in that sense. So don't avoid bringing the person up. Don't avoid talking about them. Avoid saying their name. I think that a lot of people do that. They become a bit skittish around it. We don't want to upset the person. We don't want to make it worse. You can't make it worse. The worst thing has happened. I think that ignoring it, not acknowledging it, adds to the pain. And if someone says to you, you know what, I actually don't want to talk about Mark right now, then that's okay. But unless someone says that, I think that the rule should be, don't be afraid to mention the person. Don't be afraid to bring them up. I think that brings me to another don't, is don't avoid the loss. Don't pretend that it didn't happen. Don't avoid speaking about it. Don't avoid the topic. Don't avoid the loss, the grief. Don't pretend that it's not there, because it is. The loss is a reality, and the grief is the natural response to that loss. It will be there. So I think that it can be, again, incredibly harmful, incredibly hurtful when, someone has lost an important person. It can be all that they think about. We think that if we mention it, we'll make them think about it. But chances are they're thinking about it already. Chances are it's already there, constantly. And then to have people, sort of around you almost pretend like nothing happened, it can be incredibly confusing. It can be hurtful, harmful. You go, sure, like my world just stopped. How come no one's seeing that, or no one's acknowledging that, or approaching that? Look, I know that when someone you love dies, your world stops and other people's worlds continue. That's an unfortunate but natural part of loss. Your world has stood still and everyone else's keeps moving. And that is hard. It makes grief lonely. But it's not to blame other people. It's just normal, like it's natural for other people's worlds to continue and yours to feel a little bit stagnant. But on top of that, to have people avoid the loss, it can make you question your reality. Is it really so bad for me, or am I missing something? You know what I mean? Then I think the final don't is don't make assumptions. Don't assume to know what someone else is going through. Don't assume to know what they think, what they feel, what they want. Don't assume to know anything really about their experience. I think if there's one thing you can assume is you can assume that it's hard and that it's going to be hard, and that's okay. That's to be expected. But other than that, I think we should ask the person. We should allow the person who's grieving to communicate to us what's happening for them, rather than us assuming what's happening for them, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, as you were talking, I mean, I was just taking down notes as well, and I think I agree with all of them. I mean, and I think like on a, I think the one thing I also noticed in this, I mean, this is more a personal story as well. Like my dad left when, I mean, he's late now, but my parents got separated quite early on, so there was a part of my dad that we didn't really know. But I remember at his funeral, someone came up and they said, but your dad did this or he did that, and there's something about like almost that story, like as you said, keeping that mark alive, and saying something that you almost remember, and that for me still now, I remember. And a colleague of mine, he lost his dad as well, I think probably 2 years ago, but his dad was a community leader. And he said, at the funeral, there were these people that there were hundreds of them, and they came and they gave these, they spoke about his dad, about like what he did for the community and what he did in this charity. And he says, it was like a part of his life that I didn't even know, but it meant so much, to him that people were saying that. And, so when you said that, that's the thing I remember. I remember like almost like if you could say things that keeps that person like alive in there, because they are alive. I mean, like, they're not there, but I mean, you can't, like you said, you can't, it's not, it's the worst thing. They've just lost them, but it's not like those memories go away or that person is not there. They've like carved you out, they've made certain experiences. And I think that's almost like, that's the amazing thing about human beings. I think we're all connected in some way of fashion. And like what you said, like when you said, time carries on for some people, well, it's stopped for you, and that's the amazing thing. It's like so like connected and dynamic. But I think keeping those experiences, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing I'm taking out of that is I think keeping those experiences or keeping that person alive, or remembering them, in a good way. And but this probably speaks to your authentic self as well. It can't be. I don't know if you find this, but it can't be. I mean, it can't be like I'm saying forced, but not forced. But it can't be inauthentic, because I think people see through that. It has to be authentic. It has to be. And if you don't know, like you said it multiple times so far, is just ask. It's like, because maybe you didn't know the person, but saying something like this. Like tell me about the time when your dad was Like, what was that one of the happiest moments? Do you think something like
Yes,
that would be a good idea?
absolutely, absolutely. I think with a lot of these do's and don'ts, it can feel like, oh my gosh, there's so many things I have to remember when I'm approaching someone who's lost a loved one. But, I think the most important thing to know is that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to say the perfect thing, come up with the perfect words, because the reality is that there are none. There's nothing you can do, truly. There's nothing you can do to fix this or to make the pain go away. You can try and be there, you can try and support a person, but you can't fix it, right? So you don't need to be perfect in any way. You just need to show up. You need to be there. You need to listen. You need to allow the person to be sad. And yes, I think bringing up the person who's passed, and even if you didn't know them, asking about the relationship. You're important to me because you're my friend, and this person who's died, I didn't know them, but I know they're important to you because of your relationship with them. Tell me about that relationship. Tell me about what made this person special. Tell me about why you care so much for them, or tell me about your relationship. Absolutely, I think it's a beautiful gift to give somebody who has lost a loved one, is that opportunity to speak about them, to speak about their relationship, because as you said, the person is physically gone, physically dead, but the relationship, it doesn't die. Just because your person is physically no longer here doesn't mean that the memories are gone, that the impact that they had on your life are gone, or who you are as a person. That relationship with them, it continues. In fact, if it's a really, really important person, you continue having a relationship with them, even in their absence. And I know that this is something that we often don't think. We think that, well, when someone dies, in order to grieve healthily, you need to cut your ties with them. You need to cut the bonds with them. You need to end that relationship and move forward and make new relationships. And I don't think that the reality really works that way. Your relationship changes because now you have a relationship with the person and they're no longer here physically. And a part of the grieving process, I think, is figuring out how to have a relationship with your person in their absence. How to be a daughter whose dad has died. How to have that relationship, how to keep them alive. And that can mean different things for different people. For some people that can mean hanging on to their possessions. Maybe even, maybe even keeping all of their possessions as they were, as they had left them. Maybe for some people that can be important. Maybe for other people, it's not as important to keep their possessions, but, to have a photo of them, to make a shrine, to, have a candle that they light for them on important days, or, to celebrate their birthday, or to, whatever, that celebrate your anniversary. Whatever the case may be, we find ways. It's important to find these ways to continue your relationship with the person, even though they are no longer here physically.
I like that. Yeah, and that makes complete sense. Hey, I mean, I think for me in my mind, and how it probably should be. And I think, I don't know if we mentioned this, but in the movie Avatar, it's like their whole thing was like about how the person goes back to the ground, and
Yes.
and it almost like connected with this tree, but like everyone just adds to this, and I'm a firm believer in that. It's almost like you leave back those memories, and like almost like civilization becomes better for the experience, it seems. Because I mean, as human beings, I mean, we've lived through so much of trauma and experiences during the like history as we know it. And I think, the fact that we here, it's almost like that building on the previous, generations,
Absolutely.
which is amazing.
It's
Um,
beautiful, yes.
Thanks. I want to ask something else, and because I've been trying to tie it back to that disenfranchised grief that we spoke about, previously, and I think what you said now also ties in nicely with that, because there's no, like, almost you can't force it. You can't, because like, as soon as you force it, as soon as you tell someone, actually, you shouldn't be talking about that person, or like, they're already gone, and stuff like that. When you almost like don't give yourself that opportunity to just let it live, it seems like you're creating more chaos. Is that how we would tie it in some way back to that disenfranchised grief as well? It's almost like you're forcing the person not to grieve in a certain way, and that creates its own issues.
Absolutely. I think along those lines, we have these ideas, these notions of what grief should look like. How long grief should last, how we should express grief, what's healthy and what's not healthy in terms of grief. And these rules, these notions, these ideas that we have around grief, they're often unspoken. They're just like a shared preconceived idea of what grief should look like. And the very basic of that is, as I said before, you can grieve, but not too much and not too little. And you can only grieve for a certain amount of time. You get allocated a period of time, and that period of time can differ. Sometimes sometimes it's 6 months, up to 6 months. Sometimes it's up to the first year. But generally, after the first year, the expectation is that you shouldn't be grieving anymore. That you should have overcome or gotten over your grief in that time. And with these ideas, these notions of what grief should look like, we tend to police anything that doesn't conform to that. And that's when we see, I think, disenfranchised grief, is when when we think that someone's grief does not conform to what we think grief should look like, then we try and squish it into that box. Get in there. It should look like this. You should be doing that. You shouldn't be doing this. You should be over it by now. You should be contained at work. You should be going on with your life. You shouldn't be speaking about the person. And that's when I think we tend to see disenfranchised grief, when we tend to see people's grief as it is being invalidated, being unacknowledged, dismissed, seen as not valuable, not important.
Yeah, I want to tell you this as well. So, growing up in a community that I did, there were quite a few religions, and the predominant ones were Hinduism, Muslim, Christianity, and so in the Hinduism religion, there's a 40-day ceremony after someone dies, and I think it's in some of the Christian denominations they do this as well, and it's a 1 year ceremony. And now that I think about it, and as we've been talking about this topic of loss and bereavement, there's a certain like logic to that. It's almost like you're forcing yourself in 40 days to go back, and it's like the same family that probably attended the funeral, so it's extended family, so you all get together and you almost like celebrate, not celebrating, but almost remembering. It's like a rites thing, like there's certain traditions you have to do, but in a way for the family you're almost like forcing them to think about that loss again 40 days later, 1 year later. And I just think that's, that actually makes a lot of sense now. Obviously they did it because of tradition, but whoever came up with that system, it actually makes a lot of sense in my mind, because you're almost like
Yes.
forcing, when you said 1 year, I was thinking about that, because I was thinking, okay, yeah, sure, like 1 year later, because most people are just trying to get over and forget. But 1 year later, you're forced to remember for whatever reasons, this loss. And I think it gives the family and the loved ones some level of like revisiting that Have you come across anything like that in like other ways?
You know, I think there are some cultural religious practices, that are a lot more different, than the way that I've been speaking about grief. I think that the perspective that I've seen is more the Western perspective, more the medicalized Western idea of death and dying and grief. Where even, with death being medicalized, it's seen as a failure, death is a failure of the medical system. It's not a natural and, natural thing. It's something that's not natural. It represents a failure of medicine, of technology. And, grief then is often also, not necessarily medicalized, but from the Western perspective, pathologized. It's not seen as something that is normal and natural. Not just the Western perspective, but within a capitalist society, if you think about it from that perspective, you're expected to, go back to work as soon as possible. Maybe you get 3 days compassionate leave, maybe you don't get any, depending on the relationship, because they decide if you get compassionate leave based on the relationship to the person. So, from that perspective, you're expected to move on quickly so that you can be a good worker bee and go back to work and, be productive and produce. So I think this perspective on grief is definitely more westernized one, and that perhaps in different the other cultural and religious perspectives that aren't so Western dominated may have a more connected way of dealing with death and with grief. And connected in the sense that, you do have these rituals in Hinduism that you spend time honoring the person, remembering the person, doing these last rites for the person who's died, and for the family who remain. But it is a lot more death facing, if you will. From my perspective, it's looking at death in the face and saying, okay, when someone dies, this is what we do, and this is how we approach it. And even a year later, we come together and we celebrate the person's life, or we talk about the person, or we have these rituals that's so important for us. Whereas from a Western perspective, I would say it's not death facing, it's more death avoidant. And yeah, I mean, it's difficult to speak from that perspective, because I obviously haven't had that experience myself, within a culture that focuses so much on, community, on ritual, on practices around death that's shared, that's shared across the community, within the religion, within the culture. That's not something, pardon me, that's been a part of my experience. But if I think about it, I imagine it allows more space for grief in that sense, because it is death facing. That would be yes, what I would imagine. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm quite fortunate to have said that. Like, we grew up in that type of culture. So my dad was, like, well, my parents grew up as, and I was born into like a Hindu family, but then they converted, and then my dad went back into Hinduism. So you always be connected with that side of the family. So it was always like mixed from that perspective. You knew, there's certain aunts were like Hindus. So, like we as part of the family, irrespective of your religion, you went for the ceremonies, you went for the prayers, you went for that. But keeping this actionable and irrespective of the religion, what you said so far, I think if we take something out of that and say, even as a family, almost like creating a tradition that a year later, we get together, like we do this for birthdays, maybe on death days, you have to do the same thing, get together and, you almost like support that family again. And you kind of would almost have a reality check as to where everyone is. I'm just trying to think, how I tie that, or how we tie that back to that disenfranchised grief. Because on the one hand, you have this complete blocker, as in, you're not, you should be moving past. But I think
Yes.
those type of traditions will probably force the family and the loved ones to revisit. And by revisiting, you're almost stopping that blocker. And I think that's, that's the probably, it wasn't to tell everyone they probably have to consider Hinduism,
No,
but
no,
it's
of
almost
course.
like as people, like how do we take what, like amazing people like yourself are telling us and almost create traditions, because we live in such a complicated, world that's so busy. I love the fact that you
Yes.
brought in the corporate spin, because yeah, the 3 days, the 3 days compassionate leave is ridiculous,
Absolutely.
because like, what happens if there's two deaths in a family? Like, does it come out of your sick leave, your annual leave, your unpaid leave, or
Yes,
your compassionate
it
leave?
does.
It's like,
Well, yes, absolutely.
so it just shows
It's
you, I mean, like how, as you put it nicely, worker bee centric we are around this, and how by virtue of that design, you almost gonna create problems like disenfranchised grief, because the person has to move on. I mean, like, if you don't move on, you're not gonna get paid, and if you don't get paid, that's other issues. And I know, obviously this is simplistic, but it's not as easy as that in all circumstances. But we should be, you almost like should be aware of it, so that this stuff is going to happen.
yes. I think especially because of that, if you think that you get 3 days and of compassionate leave, maybe you have to take annual leave as well, or sick leave as well, to be able to just bury your person, or have the funeral, have the last, those you know ceremonies or rituals rather that we do when somebody dies. And then you have to say, for example, bury your person on the Friday and Monday you're back at work. Yes, you do have to find a way to manage that, to go back to work, even though you might not be ready emotionally, or you might not be in any way, shape, or form okay. Being aware of that and conscious of that, I think, can be so important. If I think about the people around that person, the colleagues, for example. So, pardon me, I think even having 2 or 3 weeks off after somebody died is not enough. So going back for someone is going to be hard. And then I think that if we're aware of that, this is going to be hard for the person. And, how can we best support the person coming back to work? What can we do? Or what shouldn't we do? But, being aware of that, I think, is the first place to start, because it's just not realistic to expect someone to come back to work a few days, a few weeks, even after somebody they love has died, and to be as they were, to go back to normal, because chances are there is no normal anymore. That there is no normal after somebody you love dies. You have to figure out what normal is after that. So I think that's incredibly important, given that our society is constructed in a way that doesn't really give people room to grieve, to not be okay.
Yeah, and like, again, tying it back to the disenfranchised grief, I just think maybe that's part of the, almost like the structure we put in place as a society to almost like move people, past that, so that is the blocker. The blocker is actually, you do have to get on with your life, and you don't have that space, to think too much about it, because you just have to get back on the wagon and just keep on going. And
Yes.
that almost like, is the reason people end up seeking counsel from yourself, or therapists like yourself, around the grief, because almost like they have been, they have to have moved past, and almost like not given that space.
Yes. I think for some people it's helpful, to be honest. I think, you know, for some people it can be really helpful to have something else to focus your mind to, or to distract you, or to avoid the reality.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, you know, whether you postpone your grief or not, you know, grief will be there. It's just the natural and normal response to, you know, losing somebody that we love. So, you know, I personally, I think that when we don't allow our natural response, our reactions, our natural reactions space, we don't give them space, it's detrimental to us in the long term. Because, all right, if you don't have the capacity to deal with it now, that's okay, but it will come up. It will come back. You know, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. So yes, but I think that even if it's so, for some people it can be helpful, and for other people, you know, it can be incredibly difficult to try and focus your mind, you know, to try and concentrate on something that, you know, maybe last week you were able to do in a breeze, you know, no problem. Now you're struggling to concentrate on this task that would have been really simple and quick and easy for you. You know, I think it's, for some people, incredibly difficult to manage both moving forward, because I don't think there's moving on. You're moving forward and dealing with the loss, managing the grief. It's an incredibly difficult position to be in. It's incredibly overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people.
Mm. I love that term that you just used, because it's my second last question is and so, you know, we're covering the person, you know, from a loss point of view. Um, you know, I come from a software background, and I've had this idea for a long time, and we're going to incorporate it actually soon in one of our, you know, products. But I have this idea, and it came from one of those movies. I can't remember the name now, to be honest. I want to think Notebook, but I don't think it may be that. But this person leaves a bunch, like a series of letters for his, you know, his loved one,
P.S.
and
I
you know,
love you.
oh yeah, okay, it was that. And you know, she had to do things like, you know, like as he said in his letter, you know, almost like for her to live her life and in some ways remember him. I thought that was like beautiful, you know, like, and almost like, you know, my question is, how can we prepare loved ones, you know, for that loss? And this is like probably, again, it's one of those topics that you never talk about, right? But, you know, you talk about your will, and you have this document, like, I need to be, you know, like if something happens to be, I need to be cremated or buried,
Yes.
or, you know, I need this thing to be, this thing to happen with this, you know, possession or whatever. But we almost like don't prepare our loved ones for that eventuality, although we know that eventuality is going to happen. So coming back to the software idea, it was almost like leaving this stuff, you know, behind, and almost like saying, you know, when my daughter is 18, I would like this thing to happen. You know, like almost like this letter gets automatically delivered to her. You know, in my mind, I'm thinking like that. You know, when she gets married, I would love this message, you know, to be, you know, with her, you know, and in my voice, you know, maybe as a recording or whatever that is. You know, I think there's such a space for that. But, you know, taking the technology aspects, you know, which I kind of get excited about, and just putting it more actionable, you know, like, is there anything that we can almost do to prepare our loved ones for that eventuality that's going to happen? I mean, it's not a if and when. You know, you mentioned
Yes.
scientific and medical research. Yes, you know, maybe at some point we'll live forever, but for the reality for now, for most of us, it's going to be at some point, you know, we're not going to be around. Is there anything that we could do to prepare our loved ones?
You know, I think the only thing that we can do is to prepare ourselves, you know, in terms of what is it that we want, thinking about that, you know, thinking about having a will or a living will, you know, thinking about what you want to happen to you if you are, you know, unable to make decisions for yourself, or, you know, like you say, what you would like your your family to know. You know, are you an organ donor? Do you want to donate your organs? Is that something that's important to you? You know, I think we first have to figure out what's important to us, and how can we plan in the event that we die. You know, what can we put in place for our family, for our loved ones? And then The other thing is to talk about it. And I know that this is a tough one because for you, I know for me, I might feel incredibly comfortable talking about death, talking about my own death. Not to say that I'm not fearful. Of course I am. I'm human. I'm scared of dying. I'm scared of losing people that I love. But I feel that I do have a comfort in talking around death. I don't feel the discomfort, the awkwardness that this is a topic that should be avoided, you know. But I can imagine that for a lot of people, if I were to bring up, you know, the fact that I am going to die and what I would like in the event of my death, I can imagine people saying, "Oh my goodness, must you be so morbid?" You know, do we have to talk about this? This is, I don't want to think about you dying. Like, you know, I can imagine that it can be a really difficult conversation to have for some people. But the truth of it is that I do think that we need to talk about these things. You know, we need to talk about death, talk about, you know, our own death, our own feelings, our own wants, our own desires, you know, not just in a practical sense in terms of do I want to be buried or cremated or, you know, planted in a tree urn, you know, not just in terms of the practical sense, but in the, you know, if I'm not there for your wedding, this is what I want you to know. You know, this is what I'd hope you will know on your wedding day if I'm not there. If I'm there, I'll tell you myself, but if I'm not, I want you to know this, you know, because, you know, I think it can be morbid, weird, uncomfortable in the moment. But in the event that you're not there for your daughter's wedding, she'll have had those words, she'll have had that memory, and she'll be thinking, my dad wants me to know this on this day. And that, I think, is incredibly beautiful. I think it can, if we get past the awkwardness, if we get past the discomfort, there's so much room for deep and meaningful connection, real connection. Because, you know, when we're conscious of the fact that we're going to die, as scary as that is, you know, we can genuinely, I think, you know, there's an opportunity for us to be our genuine and authentic selves, to be able to say, you know, I love you with all my heart. You know, you're such an important person to me. I love you so much that with the barriers and the defenses that we ordinarily have, it might be incredibly difficult to say, you know, but that can foster such a beautiful connection. I think that when you have those conversations, if I have those conversations with my loved ones and I am, you know, should I die tomorrow, I'll have had the conversations, you know, they'll have known that I love them or that they're important to me or that, you know, I want to donate my organs. You know, there'll be that connection, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I love your phrases, and I mean, you even in the other show, I mentioned that. But you know what you said now is what I was thinking when I asked the question was that real connection. You know, we had a recent episode on suicide as an example, and you know what suicide does is like it leaves that most of the time, you know, it leaves that like that sense of non-closure. You know, like you don't know why the person did it in most cases and stuff like that. And I find the same thing, like, you know, the will is, yes, you know, we should have that and all of that stuff, but it's kind of like cold. And most people, you know, most people, like the will is a surprise, you know, and I'm just thinking, you know, if I use your term and say that's like not a real connection then, because the person doesn't even know what's going to happen. You know, we haven't had those conversations and said, actually, you know, when something happens to me, oh, you know, when it does, you know, I would like this thing to happen, and it's already in my will, so you know about it when that happens. But this is a conversation I want to have with you. Whereas I find like wills are almost like, again, it's a cop out, because you know you put all of these things, but your family is like the last one to know what you're actually going to do with your house or your car or whatever that is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's missing. You know, it's like
Yes.
yeah,
I think the
because
other
as you
thing
said,
there, sorry.
sorry, as you said, you know, like it's like this taboo topic and people are scared of the topic, and I just think it's like a reality. We there already. If you're going to do the will, why not just have the conversations? And if you can almost like prepare in some way, because we prepare for everything else. We prepare for the wedding, we prepare for this, we prepare even for the funeral. But we haven't prepared our loved ones in some way for that eventuality that's going to happen. And I think that's kind of missing in society. I don't know if anyone does this well, but from my personal experience, I don't know of anyone. And I just think that, conversations like this, conversations with people like yourself, should almost like spur on the thought of saying, what do I want to do, when that does happen?
Absolutely. Another thing that is recently that I've become aware of is, when we don't have these conversations and something does happen to you, and say you don't die, but you're in a position where, you are unable to, you don't have the capacity to make decisions for yourself. And then in the absence of these conversations, your loved ones also don't know. They don't know what you would want. They don't know, would you want to be resuscitated, for example? Would you want to turn the machines off? In the event that you're not actually dead, but you're not able to make the decisions, for yourself. Without these conversations, your loved ones are left to guess for you, to guess, okay, knowing dad or knowing this person, what do I think they would want in this scenario, whereas if you have these conversations, the onus isn't on them to guess because you'll have told them, I know, again, we're coming to the practicalities of things of, a living will, as well as, not just having a will for when you die, but a living will that discusses these things. Do you want to be resuscitated? Do you want the machines to be turned off? Do you want to be in a vegetable state? Do you not? Do you, where you can actually put pen to paper and say, this is what I want for myself. And I make these decisions so that you don't have to, because, this is what I want for me. So in the absence of these conversations, we don't know what our loved ones want. We have to guess. And then with that, I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to have to decide for your loved one. To have to, you have to sign the document that says, don't resuscitate. For you to make that decision on behalf of your loved one, conversation, it's an incredible, I don't want to use the word burden, but it feels like an incredible responsibility. And you're always going to be left with did I make the right decision? Did I really do what they wanted me to do? Or, would he have wanted something different in the end? And maybe not having the opportunity to have those questions answered. So yes, the conversations are difficult and they might feel awkward, but they could be incredibly important. The practical things as well as the relational elements, the connection, or to be able to say, this is something of my possessions that's really important to me and it's special to me because of this and this and this. And in the event that I die, I want you to have it because I think you'll appreciate, why it's special to me. Talking about those things, and it adds that meaning, those extra layers of meaning in the event that you do die. Now your person knows that, they gave me this mug because this was their favorite mug and they loved it so much, and now I'm going to cherish it, I think it also, if we were talking about that relationship that we continue with the person when they've died, it helps us to do that when we've discussed these things, when we've spoken about them in a way that's open and honest and genuine and connected.
Yeah. And I don't know, the more I speak to you, the more I realize there's an open space at the moment. We talk about pre-marriage counseling, we talk about couples counseling, we talk about all of these things, but how about a loss counseling or a pre-loss counseling? There must be a space, even if we can't, because as you said, these are difficult conversations, but having specialists like yourself, to facilitate a session like that, would be amazing, because we seem to do it for many other things, there's interventions, there's all of those kind of things. But I definitely think there's a space for this, and for some reason, as a society, it's a taboo thing. But
Yes,
I think it's necessary. I think
absolutely.
maybe in some ways, hopefully a spark comes along. But I think even in your practice, it will be interesting to see how that evolves. With someone like yourself that specializes in this type of loss, therapy or loss based.
Now that you've said that, I think about people who are terminally ill and who are maybe not afforded that opportunity to have these conversations with their loved ones, because even with people who are terminally ill, we avoid the topic of death. We like to hope and believe, even when everything says this person isn't going to make it, that they're reaching the end. We hold on to hope, and I think that's a natural thing. We do it. I mean, we can be facing all the logical facts and we can be completely rational, and there'll still be a tiny spark of hope. Just maybe there'll be a miracle. Maybe just we can't help it. We can't help but hope. But I think about the experience from the terminally ill person's perspective, and knowing that you're going to die, knowing that not maybe in a few years, not but soon, and it's coming and you can't avoid it, and maybe not having that opportunity to speak to your family about how you're feeling about you dying, because we don't want to talk about death, or being able to say, like we've been saying, to have the conversations to prepare loved ones, but also to connect in those last few months, weeks, days. Without talking about death, I think it's very difficult to connect with someone who's dying.
Yeah. Yeah, I love these conversations with you, Beanie. I mean, and although it's like probably one of the most difficult conversations, it's amazing how it flows, and it's amazing how many insights, we get from it. Well, I definitely get it, and I firmly believe now, after the 2 episodes that we've had, that there's a space for some type of loss counseling or pre-loss counseling. That's my probably thing. But even something that I would consider, as in, for our family, to say, how do we prepare each other for this part? Our kids are at that level where they probably can understand the stuff, and what happens, if something happens to mom or dad or both, as an example. So yeah, I love this. And it's amazing how fast time flies. But I do have to ask the last
Yes.
question before I let you go. Is there anything around this topic that you thought I should have asked you that I didn't?
Well, I know that we discussed the don'ts in supporting someone, but I don't know how much we discussed all of the do's that I had in mind. Is there time for me to
Yeah, 100%.
mention the do's?
Definitely.
Okay, so the do's, I would say, I think I have mentioned, is to acknowledge the loss. We start there with acknowledging that this is real, that this is hard, and that, that's okay. To show up and listen, so not avoid, to be there and to mirror the person's reality, right? To reflect their pain, reflect whatever it is that they're presenting with, instead of trying to cheer them up. Asking them questions, ask how they're doing, what's real for them, what would be comforting for them, how can you be there for them, how can they feel more supported by you. So if you're not sure, just ask. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to say the right thing. You don't have to say the perfect words. You just need to show up and follow your friend's lead. You don't have to have all the answers. Another thing that we didn't mention that I think is really important is to be conscious of platitudes and rainbows. So platitudes are the things that we say to try and fix things, to try and make things better. The phrases that are so recycled and reused so often that they've become empty of meaning. Like I said, the scripted thing that we say, I'm so sorry for your loss. My sincere condolences to you and your family. Let me know if there's anything you need. That sort of scripted sort of platitude. And then the rainbows. So the rainbows is like focusing on the positive, looking for the silver lining. Sometimes there's a space for that, but I would say unless your friend is leading with that, or your person who's grieving is leading with that, don't start there. Don't start with platitudes and rainbows. I think that we often say things because we don't know what to say, and because we desperately want to make things better. But sometimes when we say these platitudes, when we say these rainbows, it can come across dismissing and make people feel like their pain isn't valid, that it needs to be different. Then another do is to stay in the present. If it's awkward, if it's uncomfortable, it's okay. Just be awkward. Just be uncomfortable. Just stay in that moment. The best thing that you can do for someone who is grieving is to just show up and sit there. Sit in your helplessness. If that comes up when you're facing their pain, just stay there. Stay with them and make space for their pain. So I think, those are the do's that I would say in supporting someone who's grieving.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for covering that and reminding me of that as well. I thought we did, but obviously, as you reminded us, I think we missed a few points. But thanks for reminding me about that. I love this conversation. I loved having you on the show again. So thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation myself.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.